Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second Fall 2025 Northeast Cover Crops Council webinar. I'm Victoria Ackroyd, the Program Manager for the Council. My co-host is Susan Brulette, who is a Program Manager for the Northwest Crops and Soils Program at UVM Extension. Before I introduce today's speaker, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, feel free at any time to throw them into the chat as they come to mind, and I'll be handling question moderation at the end of the session. Today's session counts for one professional development CCA CEU. To get credit, please either email your full name and CCA number to Susan. I'll throw her email address in the chat shortly, or you can direct that information in the chat itself to Susan. This webinar is being recorded and will be available soon on the UVM and NECCC websites, along with a PDF of the presentation, with thanks to Etienne. And now for today's speaker. Dr. Etienne Sutton is the Program Manager for the National Cover Crop Variety Project at the MU Center for Regenerative Agriculture. She's trained as an agroecologist, and she specializes in crop diversification, especially with cover crops, soil health, and climate resilience. She also has expertise in participatory research approaches, including community and citizen science. Etienne holds a PhD in resource ecology and management and a BS in environmental studies from the University of Michigan. Etienne, thank you for joining us today to talk about 2024 through 2025 trial results from the National Cover Crop Variety Testing Network. You have the floor.
Thank you for that introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, is everybody seeing that okay? Looks good. Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon. So I'm excited today to introduce all of you to the National Cover Crop Variety Testing Program and share our latest round of results with you today. The cover crop variety testing program was started in recognition of the fact that we don't yet have a large-scale coordinated effort to help farmers and farm advisors understand which cover crops are best suited to their region, goals, and systems. A lot of cover crop trials have just been focused at the species level, but there's actually a lot of diversity within each species at the varietal level as well. So just like there are different varieties of tomatoes or corn or soybeans, there are also different varieties of some of the most popular cover crop species, some of which may work better than others for your farm depending on your climate, soil type, management practices, and crop rotation. For example, the photo on this slide here shows two different varieties of Balanza clover. So the variety on the left has been specifically bred for use as a high biomass, high nitrogen annual cover crop, whereas the variety on the right is an older variety with dramatically different characteristics in terms of growth, maturity, and other traits that might make it less suitable as a cover crop. So our goal is to help farmers find the right cover crop variety for their region, goals, and system so that they can really maximize the economic and conservation benefits of this practice. So we launched the network last fall in partnership with 12 sites spanning a wide range of soil and climatic conditions, including 3 in the Northeast, so Vermont, New York, and Pennsylvania. We owe a big thank you in particular to our collaborators at North Carolina State University, so Chris Reberg Horton, Alyssa Woodard, and Slater Enriquez Inoa for planning and coordinating a lot of the work around this variety testing program. The trials included 25 different cover crop varieties representing 6 species, including winter pea, crimson clover, hairy vetch, cereal rye, winter canola, and radishes. These varieties are a combination of commercially available varieties, so ones that farmers can go out and purchase right now, as well as some experimental varieties from the Cover Crop Breeding Network, which is a public plant breeding program working to develop new and improved cover crop varieties that meet the needs of all the different types of farms that we have across the country. The varieties that you see here on this slide that are marked with an asterisk and that have sort of a funky letter and number code rather than a catchy variety name are experimental varieties that the Cover Crop Breeding Network is developing. So some of the major goals of the cover crop breeding network, just to briefly give you an overview of some of their work, includes breeding for better winter hardiness, greater above and below ground biomass, suitability for grazing, and different flowering times. We've been hearing from a lot of farmers that finding a variety with the right maturity can be really important for successful termination, especially in cases where you might need to kill the cover crop at a specific growth stage, like with roller crimping. Most cover crop seed right now is actually sold as variety not stated or VNS seed, which means the origins, quality, characteristics of the seed is actually unknown. And it can even be an assortment of multiple seed lots from different years or regions. So you can end up with plants that mature at different times, making that management at termination harder than it potentially needs to be. The cover crop breeding network also has some goals that are specific to particular species. For example, hairy vetch is notorious for reseeding and sometimes creating weed problems, but they're working on a soft seeded variety that would eliminate that issue and make it more easily used as a cover crop. For cereal rye, one trait that's of interest is allelopathy, which is where chemicals released by one plant influence the survival of other plants, which can be used strategically to then control weeds. So they're working on developing cereal rye varieties with both high and low levels of allelopathy, and you can see in this photo here that this does show a lot of promise so far. There's this visible ring around the rye plant in that photo of weeds actually being repelled. So if you're interested in learning more about the cover crop breeding network's work, you can check out their website at covercropbreeding.com. And now back to these variety trials in terms of how they were set up and what the experimental design was. At each of the 12 sites, the trials were planted in a randomized split plot design with 3 replicates. The cover crops were drill seeded into plots of roughly 5 by 15 feet using recommended seeding rates in fall of 2024, and then they were left to overwinter into spring of 2025. The exact planting and termination dates varied by site based on typical management practices for each of the locations. At each of those sites, our collaborators collected a standard set of evaluation metrics, including fall emergence, which is a visual estimate of the percentage of plants that emerged in the plot roughly 2 months after planting or before first frost, depending on location. And then, similar to fall establishment, spring stand was a visual estimate of the percent of plants emerging in the plot after spring green up and is a pretty good indicator of winter hardiness when assessed in conjunction with fall establishment. And then in the spring before termination, we collected shoot biomass samples in each of the plots using destructive sampling with a quadrat to quantify biomass in pounds per acre, which is directly linked to a lot of the benefits from cover crops, including nutrient retention, nitrogen supply from legumes, weed control, and potential for building soil health. So really a key metric there. We also evaluated cover crop maturity at termination by recording the percent of plants flowering in each of the plots. And then finally, we did have the opportunity to test some new camera technology pictured here that will hopefully eliminate the need to perform destructive biomass sampling in the future by automating that process using AI and machine learning, which will make a much more efficient data collection process. There were also a few optional evaluation metrics, including collecting root cores, which will allow for quantifying how root traits and root biomass varies not only across species and varieties, but also across this really nice range of soil and climatic conditions that we have represented in the network. If there were any diseases present, we took note of the percent of plants in the plot showing disease. Weed suppression was rated on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being excellent weed control and 5 being very poor weed control. And then finally, some sites also collected an average stand height measurement. The 2024-2025 results were compiled into a report which you can access for free on the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture website. And it includes a results table for each of the 12 sites, along with weather conditions at each site during that cover crop growing season. So this is an example from our Vermont site. The evaluation metrics are listed in the top row of the table, and then the species and varieties are along the leftmost column. And then the values in the table are the averages for each of the varieties. You'll want to note that the winter canola and radishes are lumped together into a brassicas category at the bottom. And then in terms of analysis for each site, we analyzed the data to see if there were statistically significant differences across varieties for each species. And where there were significant differences, we indicated this with letters, such that any varieties that do not share a letter are indeed statistically different from each other. So, for example, across winter pea varieties in Vermont, there were significant differences in spring stand. Survivor, which is marked with an A, is a variety bred for winter hardiness and early greenup and showed significantly better spring stand than Frostmaster, which is marked with a B. And then the other three varieties there, YO Winter, Austrian Winter Pea, and Keystone, are all marked with an A and a B, which means they had intermediate performance and were not significantly different from either Survivor or Frostmaster. So that's just a quick overview of how to interpret the tables in case you want to check out the report in more detail. When we look at average performance of all the species and varieties across the 12 sites, we do see some important trends emerging even after just 1 year of data collection. So the graph on the top is showing fall emergence, and the one on the bottom is spring stand. Cereal rye had the best fall emergence and spring stand overall compared to the other species in the trials. And for the legumes, hairy vetch and crimson clover did have slightly higher and more consistent spring stand than the winter peas, suggesting a slight advantage in terms of winter hardiness. And here we have biomass shown in the top graph and weed suppression shown on the bottom graph. Both cereal rye and winter canola produced substantial amounts of biomass in the spring, though we do see some variation across varieties for each of those species, which we'll dig into a little bit more in a minute. For the legumes, hairy vetch and winter pea produced slightly more spring biomass than crimson clover. And even though the radishes, so Arify and driller radish, winter killed in most locations, I've included their fall biomass here on the graph to show that they did produce just as much biomass in that short window before frost as clover did in the spring. So just an interesting tidbit there. And then the last thing I'll note about biomass is that there is previous research showing that aiming for a minimum threshold of 1,000 pounds per acre is really key for reducing nutrient losses for farm fields, and reaching 2,000 pounds per acre is even better because that's when soil health benefits really start to kick in from these cover crops. And so far, all of these species and varieties in the trials are showing good potential for reaching those thresholds. And then for weed suppression on the bottom of this slide, a score of 1 indicated really good weed control, whereas a higher score of 5 meant the weed control was very poor. And both cereal rye and hairy vetch provided really strong weed control on average across all the sites. If we now look at results at the species level, some interesting patterns begin to emerge. For example, with cereal rye, we see really strong evidence of regional adaptation across varieties. So this graph is showing that in California, Texas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, which were our trial sites with the mildest weather, there were 3 varieties marked with stars on this slide that had significantly higher biomass and earlier maturity than the other varieties at those sites. And those varieties were Renzo Brizzi, Elbon, and an experimental variety from North Carolina called NC20R109. So those would all be good options for folks looking for rye varieties to use in mild climates. On the other hand, in North Dakota, which had the harshest winter of all the sites, ND Gardner, which is a cereal rye variety specifically bred to withstand those really harsh North Dakota winters, showed a significant advantage relative to the other rye varieties in terms of winter survival and biomass. So, really demonstrating that selecting the right variety for your climatic conditions can be crucial for ensuring successful cover cropping. I know the northeastern climate isn't quite as harsh as Fargo, North Dakota, and so pretty much all rye varieties should overwinter in your area. But what might be important to pay attention to is differences in maturity. Some varieties are bred specifically for early maturity, like ND Gardner, while others, like Elbon, have a more intermediate maturity. And we just added a new variety to the trials this fall called Wheeler, which is supposed to have especially late maturity. So this would be important to consider in the context of how you plan to terminate your cover crop and what the next crop is going to be, as well as if you're hoping to graze your cover crop. There were also significant differences in rye stand height, so just another trait that might be helpful to pay attention to. Specifically, we saw ND Gardner and another forage variety having significantly shorter height than some of the other varieties. For brassicas, we found that the two radish varieties winter killed in all but two locations, so North Carolina and Texas. But at sites where they were able to produce substantial biomass before winter kill, including places like New York, Indiana, and Missouri, they both offered really excellent weed control in the spring due to these really thick residue mats that they left behind. And then for winter canola, all three varieties did survive the winter at every site except North Dakota, suggesting that winter canola does have pretty good promise as an overwintering brassica cover crop. We aren't seeing any major trends or differences across winter canola varieties quite yet, and that's in part because it's the newest species to join the cover crop breeding network. But we do expect to see improvements in terms of regional adaptation and other cover crop traits in the coming years as they make more breeding progress with this species. Similar to cereal rye, we did find strong evidence of regional adaptation for crimson clover varieties. So, in the Northeast, including New York, Vermont, and Pennsylvania, Hauser's Ostat stood out as the best performing variety this past year. It was originally developed in Germany for hardiness zones 6 and lower, so it was actually a pleasant surprise to see it excel even as far north as Vermont. And then in the Midwest, a variety called Kentucky Pride, which was developed by the University of Kentucky, performed the best. And then in the Southeast, specifically North Carolina and Tennessee, an experimental variety from Maryland performed best in terms of biomass and was also significantly earlier to reach maturity than the other varieties, while Kentucky Pride showed later maturity at those sites. And now, one of the most interesting things to emerge about vetch recently is that there has actually been a completely separate species of vetch hidden within hairy vetch germplasm called smooth vetch. Purple bounty vetch, which is marketed and sold as a hairy vetch variety, is actually mostly smooth vetch. And this discovery was made by Neil Toulouse of the Cover Crop Breeding Network. This map on the slide here is from their recently published paper showing that smooth vetch excels in the southeastern and Pacific Northwest regions of the US, shown in red, whereas hairy vetch does better in the green areas. Smooth vetch is not as winter hardy as hairy vetch and also tends to struggle in loose soils, but can outperform hairy vetch in heavier clay soils. And this is indeed what we found at our variety trial sites. So, at our two sites with sandy soils, Maryland and North Carolina, purple bounty vetch, so the smooth vetch, produced roughly half as much biomass as the best performing variety at those sites. On the other hand, Purple Bounty did really well at the other two southeast sites, Tennessee and Texas, which had silt loam and clay loam soil respectively, so those heavier soils. And for all of you in the northeastern region, you might notice on the map that there isn't really a definitive winner between smooth vetch and hairy vetch across the whole region. And this is in part because of the range of soil types and microclimates across the region. So my suggestion would be to first evaluate your soil type to try to pick a suitable option. Or you could go ahead and plant both purple bounty vetch and another vetch variety like the Montana vetch sold by Green Cover Seed, which is less likely to contain any smooth vetch, and see which does better on your farm. And now, if we look at hairy vetch performance on average across the 12 sites, we found that one of the cover crop breeding network's experimental varieties, called 22MNHV, produced 6 to 10% more biomass than the other varieties. And given this strong performance, it's now moving towards commercial release given these promising results. So encouraging to see some improvements. For winter peas, we again saw some clear regional and climatic trends. In the Northeast, so New York, Vermont, and Pennsylvania, the Survivor and Wyo winter varieties had high winter survival and spring biomass, while Keystone and Frostmaster tended to underperform relative to the other varieties. At sites with milder climates, including Maryland, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Missouri, and California, Keystone did appear to have slightly earlier maturity than the other winter pea varieties, and Survivor had slightly later maturity, but there were minimal differences in the other evaluation metrics at those particular sites. And then in Indiana, Nebraska, and North Dakota, so sort of a Midwestern region there, there was very little winter survival overall for any of the winter pea varieties, which could potentially indicate a need for continued plant breeding to develop more winter hardy options, especially in these areas where there may not be reliable snow cover over the winter. So to summarize a few of the key findings from this first year of the National Cover Crop Variety Testing Program, we did find really clear evidence that selecting cover crop species and varieties based on site-specific conditions can have significant benefits. And when selecting varieties, it's important to consider multiple factors, including regional adaptation. So does a variety seem to work well for your specific climate? Does the variety fit within your management system in terms of termination dates and methods, or if you plan to graze the cover crop? Does it tolerate the soil conditions in your field? And finally, is it going to help meet any specific management goals that you might have, like weed control? We are excited to continue generating more information about cover crop variety performance and selection, including having data available on cover crop root traits soon, which really play a critical role in soil health from cover crops. We'll also be generating data about how different species and varieties influence the soil microbiome and associated soil functions. We have a team working on creating curriculum related to cover crop breeding and varietal diversity for college classrooms. And we're also hoping to translate our variety trial findings into online decision support tools to help with variety selection. If you'd like to see the trials in person, also keep an eye out for field days in the future. For the 2025-2026 trial season, we have added additional varieties of each of the species already included in the trials, as well as a couple of varieties of Balanza clover based on farmer feedback in terms of what they would like to see in the trials. So this brings the total count up to 35 varieties representing 7 species this year. We also added a new site in Michigan for a total of 13 research trial sites now. However, I do want to acknowledge that one of the major limitations of the network in its current state is that management is held fairly constant across those 13 research sites so that we can make robust comparisons across multiple locations with contrasting environmental conditions. But we know that in the real world, farmers are managing their cover crops in all sorts of different ways. And it's important to capture that variation to get a more complete picture of which species and varieties are best suited to different farming systems. And then when we also consider that a recent study found farmers are 40% more likely to adopt or change practices that are supported by on-farm research compared to research not conducted on farms, it's really clear that our variety testing efforts would benefit from bringing farmers into the network as partners to help translate this research into practice. So this fall, we launched a complimentary on-farm variety testing component where we're partnering with farmers across the country who will grow and observe variety trials in their own fields. This will help us generate practical and context-specific information about cover crop variety performance to inform decision making. We've also invited these farmers to include their own cover crop seed in the trials as a point of comparison to understand how their business as usual cover crop or whatever they typically plant as their cover crop, which is often VNS, then compares to the named varieties in the trials. We're hoping this participatory variety testing will help increase farmer engagement with and awareness of the wide range of varieties available and the benefits of using varieties tailored to your specific system and goals. So here is a map of all of our variety trial sites for the 2025-2026 season, including the 13 research trial sites shown in red, and then the 75 on-farm sites shown in blue, representing 26 different states. We invited all types of farms to participate, ranging from small-scale diversified vegetable farms all the way to large row crop farms. And you can see we have pretty strong participation across the Northeast, especially in New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. These on-farm trials are intended to be really flexible to suit the needs and preferences of each individual farmer. When they signed up for the trials, each farmer selected which species they wanted to test, and then we randomly assigned a subset of varieties to each participant, either 2 or 3 varieties per species, depending on their capacity. The on-farm trials do focus specifically on varieties that are commercially available to farmers, and this year includes 6 cereal rye varieties, 4 winter canola or rapeseed varieties, 2 radish varieties, a wide range of clovers, including 2 berseem, 2 crimson, and 2 balanza varieties, 6 winter pea varieties, and then 5 hairy vetch varieties. And the plot sizes for these trials range all the way from 5 by 15 feet up to 1/8 of an acre per variety to accommodate different planting methods and farm sizes. We provide guidance in terms of planting dates and other management details, but ultimately we leave it up to the farmers to manage the trials in the same way they would typically manage their cover crops so that we get this really real world picture of how these varieties perform across different farms. To manage these trials, we are using a participatory variety trialing platform called SeedLinked, which has features for everything from randomly assigning varieties, collecting data, viewing results, and even a community discussion dashboard. In terms of data collection, a lot of the metrics are similar to what is being measured at the research trial sites, with the exception that we are having participants collect data using a Likert style scale, so on a scale of 1 to 5, wherever possible to keep things quick and easy for everyone. But because biomass is such an important trait for cover crops linked to everything from nutrient retention to nitrogen fixation, weed control, soil health, etc., we are using a new protocol that combines plant height measurements and ground cover photos to estimate biomass rather than just a 1 to 5 rating. So this ground cover or percent cover and height protocol can give us a pretty accurate estimate of cover crop biomass with way less time and materials than destructive sampling with a quadrat would otherwise require. For folks who do want to invest a little bit more time and energy into data collection for their trials, we have some optional metrics they can collect, including disease observations, digging up roots to look at the size of the root system, uploading photos and comments about any pollinators they see in the plots, and for anyone planning to graze or cut the cover crops for forage, they can evaluate regrowth potential by performing that quick and easy biomass protocol at multiple time points throughout the season. And now to account for all of the variation that we have across farms, because they're all these unique systems hosting their trials, we will have participants enter information about how they managed their cover crops and what the environment was like throughout the season. So this information helps us interpret the trial results by understanding the specific context and conditions at each farm. So for management, this includes things like the preceding crop, planting date and method, termination date and method, and the subsequent crop. And for environment, we want to know things like the type and quality of the soil in the variety trial plots, soil moisture at the time of planting, any climate stress throughout the season, and we'll also calculate growing degree days and precipitation during the cover crop growing season based on the reported planting and termination dates. So definitely stay tuned for our first year of on-farm trial results coming this next spring. We certainly welcome your feedback as we refine and grow our variety testing program. So if there are species, varieties, traits, or other types of information that you'd like to see included in the program in the future, or if you're interested in getting involved, please let us know by emailing me at etiennesutton@missouri.edu, and I'll go ahead and leave my email up here on this slide for a moment. I certainly welcome any and all feedback, questions from folks. So thank you, and I am happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Etienne. I'd like to remind everybody that again, if you are here and need a CCA CEU, you need to please go on ahead and either email your full name and phone number, or not phone number, CCA number to Susan Brulette. I've put her email address in the chat, or else just throw it into the chat to her. Since this is being recorded, the chat log is also going to be downloaded. And so with that, we've had a lively discussion in the chat while you were presenting, Etienne, topic of great interest to folks. And we may have to draw in a few of our Vermont folks to help answer some of these questions. So I'll just take it from the top. And by all means, if anyone else has a question and feels too shy, feel free to throw it into the chat instead of at the end we can raise our hands or just unmute and ask. Anyway, so we have at least one home gardener on this call who is curious about how they can grow cover crops since they have no-till raised beds. And so we've had some suggestions from other audience members about tarping or using a weed whacker. Do you have any suggestions?
Um, I don't think I have any specific suggestions other than that we will be building this really wonderful database of cover crop management and performance across lots of different types of farms with this network. And so we do have quite a few home gardeners and smaller scale farms where we will hopefully be able to learn from what they're doing on their farms. And this information will be publicly available. We'll make sure to be sharing information as we gather it. So I certainly encourage you to sort of stay tuned as we start generating data from this on-farm network.
Awesome, thank you. I see Solvay's raised her hand. If you want to go on ahead and unmute, feel free.
Sure. I just wanted to add, I was at a field day yesterday in conversation with some other garden scale or very small market gardeners. And their strategy is to use a cover crop mixture that will winter kill. So
Ah,
then
good
it
one.
will just turn into more mulch on top of your no-till raised bed. So that's always an option. Certainly benefits to overwintering cover crops, but there are great places for strategic winter kill as well.
Gotcha. Thank you. And actually, since you're got your hand near your mute button, I saw you had responded to Ken, who was asking what the timeline is for getting these experimental varieties to the market.
Mhm.
Ken, do you need further explanation, or did Solvay handle it pretty well in the chat for you? 1 to 2 years until commercial availability, most likely 2 to 3 for the winter pea variety.
Mhm.
It's a very involved process from the look of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Ken's also asking about triticale breeding.
Yeah.
We are not working on triticale in our network yet, but I know there's are lots of triticale varieties developed by various seed companies.
Okay. Because of its higher seed yield and its wider range of traits. Yeah. Okay. Good to know somebody's working on it. If someone, and by all means, Eddie, and I know we all move around in the country, but you may not be comfortable with this, but maybe someone who's in the Northeast could comment on whether it's too late to plant a good cover crop in Northeast Kingdom, Vermont.
Uh, I certainly don't think it's too late for something like cereal rye. A lot of times you can throw that out as late as like mid-November and it will pop up in the spring, even if there isn't much fall growth. It is certainly pushing the limits for the legumes. They might struggle a little bit. But yeah, something like cereal rye, I think would do perfectly fine, even if you waited into, the late fall.
Okay. Thank you. All right, let's go down and see. Probably couldn't have sooner because of the drought. Yep, I'm down in actually Northern Virginia myself, and it's been terribly dry. It's a good point that you want some rain unless you've got access to irrigation usually. Someone said here in, I think that's central New York, we have seen a typical deadline for some cover cropping in mid-October. Very cool. Someone else says, I'm also in Northeast Kingdom. You won't get much biomass or mulching impact if sowing anything now. You could seed now to get germination in the spring. And I don't know if Heather Darby's on the call. She's in Susan's office. But she's done some great work about tillering, and I think it's rye, and how important tillering is, and you really have to get it in time in the fall if you want good tillering for the spring to get good biomass yield. So thank you all for that. We had another person who was asking about, maybe this is getting into too much philosophy, but we have plenty of time on this session left. So cover crops are not harvested. You put them back into soils for nutrients. And I know that opinions vary depending on whether you're participating in a cost share program, what you can do with it. Does anyone want to comment on their philosophy about, is it a cover crop still if you harvest it for its oil seed, or should we just not touch that one on this session?
Yeah, that is a complicated topic. And I'm certainly, yeah, I welcome thoughts from other folks on this one. I think a really common question right now is with the context of grazing. There are a lot of folks interested in using their cover crops for grazing or for forage because it is a really excellent way to get actually a little bit of profitability out of your cover crops. And I think the key with that is to use really deliberate management, right? So that you're not sacrificing any of the soil health benefits from your cover crops. Like if you were to overgraze, potentially that could be harmful in terms of driving those cover crop benefits. But if you are carefully managing with your cover crop grazing, you can actually see enhanced soil health benefits from this sort of synergy between the plants and animals, these integrated crop livestock systems. So it's complicated, and I think there isn't any one right answer. But yeah, really curious to hear other people's thoughts on that as well.
And actually, Ken's got his hand raised, so perhaps he'd like to provide some input. What's your thought, Ken? Oh dear, there's an audio issue there. Okay, I don't know if you can hear us normally, but you're high pitched, and can anyone else hear Ken? No. Okay. He's gonna give it a second. Zoom, it always goes off at the worst possible time. While Ken is working out his technical issue, does anyone else want to unmute and ask any questions? Well, I'd like to ask a question. One of my favorite things about science is the unexpected. And a lot of the time that comes about because something terrible has happened, like 3 months of no rain. But sometimes, for example, Neil's discovery of that cryptic species hitching a ride along with the hairy vetch. Have you found anything else of that sort interesting or unexpected so far that's come out of this work, Eddie? And I know it's a relatively new project.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to say anything for certain because we just have this 1 year of data so far. There were some instances where a variety might be marketed as having particular traits, but it turns out that some of the expression of those traits depends on where you're growing it. So for instance, like ND Gardner, the variety out of North Dakota, does have really early maturity in North Dakota and these colder climates. But when you look at it further south, because there are differences in vernalization and things like that, when you move further south with these overwintering varieties, it actually ended up being one of the latest maturing. And so it's this like really strong context dependency in terms of what we see these cover crops doing out in the field. So I think as we get more years of data and more sites participating will start to better understand what some of those sort of context dependent outcomes are. But that was one thing that I thought was really interesting in it. So the way that you're interpreting, traits that are supposed to be characteristic of these different varieties really does matter depending on your location.
Very cool. Thank you. Going back to Ken, I don't know that his audio issues are gonna shake out, but he did say in the chat, there's a long-term ongoing discussion. We're going back now to the topic of cover crops and what else you can use them for while still calling them a cover crop. There's long-term ongoing discussion in Maryland, since livestock operations often apply manure in the fall and have the high potential for nitrate leaching. We consider them to be a high priority for cover crops for water quality reasons and include them in the cost share programs despite the controversy. Yeah, things like cost share programs, you have to go back to your contact there because everyone has its own rules. So then we have another person that's asking, he says he typically uses winter rye on 70-acre corn base in Northeast Kingdom, Vermont, and plows it back in at the springtime for nutrient increase. Do you have any suggestions for something better for him to use? He's thinking of going back to all grass in the spring, and he's on a sandy gravel soil base in a high glacial outwash plain.
That is an excellent question. I guess one of my follow-up questions would then be sort of what is he looking for in terms of improvements relative to what he currently has, right? Is it
Yeah.
more nutrient supply to the subsequent crop, better weed control? Because that'll sort of help guide your decision if you want to tweak any of the species or management factors in the system.
Thank you. And so there's some ongoing discussion in the chat that you guys are welcome to keep up with other folks responding back to David about how early can you get into plant a cover crop. I don't know that, I mean, first off, David, if you want to just unmute, you guys are certainly welcome to unmute and talk with each other. Etienne also has her contact information here. And my contact information and Susan's is also available. So if you, I mean, we're all outreach folks in the end. If you ever want to, get in contact with us and have a back and forth, we can certainly do that too. Um,
It's David Ring. The
Hi.
70 acres had been currently under a contract for corn for the last 7 years, and I'd like to take it back to grass because it's time to take it back. It was 30 years in grass, went to corn because it needed to be turned over. Now I'm going back to grass after the 7 years of corn, and I'm trying to establish the best soil management plan on this land. It's not that dry. I'm not that affected by the temperatures. This summer, you could see the decrease in the corn, but I think it's in good shape still. So I'm just trying to plan for next spring, next summer, with the best grass I can and do it right this fall. Because the farmer who's done it has a contract to put it back to grass this fall. Um, so I'm just curious what to advise him to put back there.
Okay, sure. Are you, so just to make sure I'm understanding, are you imagining it being like a multi-year grass system? Is that the goal with that field? Or would you be sort of replanting on an annual basis?
Just not replanting, just cropping it from now on with grass. I have many farmers who are interested in the grass. It's not that I can't do it myself or contract it out, either one. But I don't plan
Sure.
on turning it over each year to grass. I want to put it back to grass.
Sure. Okay, so more of a perennial approach.
Correct.
Um, I may not be the best person to chime in on that. A lot of what we've been working on with this project is the annual overwintering cover crop species, and that probably is not what you would want to go for. So
No, but I need a cover crop this fall. I need to put something in to try and
okay.
give it something to when it comes in early spring. The question was, how early in the spring can I do it? Anywhere from mid-April to May 1st. That can be, I can be working at any time. The only question is the frost temperature at that point.
Yeah, I mean, if you haven't planted yet this fall, you could potentially try like a cereal rye hairy vetch mix. Um,
Hmm.
and so that would give you some nitrogen for the grasses you plant after next year. And I think there would be enough time to get some good growth out of both of those species this fall and next spring before you end up planting the grass pasture or perennial system.
Right. Watching your explanations, those two are top of my list.
Yeah, yeah, I would probably, I mean, I think um trying to think of in terms of rye, Elbon is always a classic and it is a little bit earlier maturing, so that could be a good fit depending on where you're trying to terminate things in the spring. Yeah, that would probably be my recommendation, but yeah, other thoughts from folks on the call who are located out there in the Northeast?
Jeff does point out that you should check if there's been manure spread on the corn because that'll also influence your question. And I'm way far south to feel comfortable commenting on this myself. I know NRCS, actually during the federal shutdown, their doors are probably not open. But what CRP, they have programs when you're going back into more of a perennial system that you can look into, and the rules on those change every year, so I'm not up to date on them. But once you can get back into NRCS, hopefully you're aware of them as a resource, right?
Right, and the farmer has, I got the question, how much have they done manure? They have done a good job of spreading manure into the soil while growing the corn crops. The farmer who's doing it has 1,300 head of animals, and he said it's the best uh, corn crop he's ever got out in his
Nice.
life, and the land is the best he's ever seen.
Okay. Aaron is suggesting for a spring perennial seeding, why not use a winter killed cover crop like oats? And that way you wouldn't have to deal with terminating the cover crop in the spring.
Rather than plowing it back under?
Well, that's the suggestion in the chat. Yeah,
Okay, all right, winter kill cover oats. Hadn't thought of that one.
could be useful.
Hmm.
Awesome. Any other
Thank you.
questions, or do you want to keep talking about this?
I do have a question for the group, if that's okay. Um, I am really curious. So moving forward, we continued to expand the trials. We're open to adding new species and varieties. So if there's something that folks feel should be in the trials that we don't have yet, that would be really helpful feedback. Or if there are other traits that we aren't measuring yet, or sort of like, yeah, characteristics that would be helpful to know about these cover crops. We are actively trying to improve the program. So yeah, interested in any thoughts on that from folks.
Yep, great chance to provide feedback. You don't even have to write it down now. You can just unmute and say, or throw it in the chat if you're feeling shy. Alternately, you could have 9 minutes of your day back.
What about a rate of fertilizer application? Can you give me any thoughts on that? We haven't talked
For
about fertilizer at all.
for the cover crops or for the following grass crops that you
Anything you can tell me. I'm a wannabe farmer. I've just grown grass, and anything I can learn, I would love to know.
Sure. Yeah, that's a little bit of a complicated one in part because it does depend sort of where, like what the starting point of your soil is.
Right.
So a lot of times if you already have really healthy soil where you've had good ground cover, you've had some nitrogen fixing legumes in there over the years, you can get away with recycling the nutrients basically instead of having to apply new inputs to the system through fertilizer. But if you're a little bit earlier in your like soil health journey, so the soil is like pretty depleted, that's where it can be really helpful to maybe even like jumpstart a cereal rye cover crop with a little bit of fertilizer to make sure you at least get enough biomass. And so if there's enough growth of the cover crop, you turn that back into the soil, and year after year, you start building up those nutrient reserves. And so over time, you could sort of adjust your fertilizer use as you make those soil health improvements, if that makes
I
sense.
absolutely do feel it's worth pointing out that aside from talking about manure with cover crops, the question of whether or not to put fertilizer on cover crops is still under debate because of concerns about fertilizer being put down when it's not needed. And this goes back to the full philosophical use of cover crops thing. Um, I do really want to point out, because the chat has been wonderfully active, that David, there are two folks in the chat that are offering to help. Sumner LeBaron Bryan with Vermont Agency of Ag, so I bet that they're actively open right now and could help you, has provided contact information and would be thrilled to assist. And Ryan Carb is also offering to assist and has thrown his email address into the chat. So please don't miss that information. It's always wonderful when we find people that can help on calls like this, because like I said, I'm too far south and not in the middle of the government program, so I can't comment. But thank you all for speaking up. Do we have any other questions or any other suggestions for things you'd like to see this variety trial looking at? Any other feedback for Etienne?
Been a wonderful chat.
Thank you all for joining us today. This has been a great webinar. I really appreciate it. I'd like to thank Etienne again for speaking today and you all for attending. We do hope to see you next week to hear from John Tooker at Penn State about cover crops and pest dynamics, which will count for one integrated pest management CCA CEU. Really interesting topic there too, because of, concerns about, well, can the cover crop slugs? Everybody's worried about cover crops and slugs in my neck of the woods. So I believe that Susan's probably stopped recording. If you do need that CCA CEU, please go on ahead, and at this point you'll need to probably email Susan your CCA number and your full name. And, great webinar. Thank you all. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.